paper as part of a rhetorical criticism class last semester taught by Dr. Sarah Hayden. This analysis is intended to highlight social expectations of grief and masculinity by using a narrative approach to critique Finding Nemo. I'm first going to give a bit of background about the film and then give a brief synopsis of the narrative approach that I use, as well as a bit of grief theory. I'm then going to use these to analyze Finding Nemo and discuss rhetorical implications of the film. So Finding Nemo was written and produced by Disney and Pixar in 2003. The story begins with a clownfish couple, Coral and Marlin, celebrating the luxuries of their new home that overlooks the open ocean and fantasizing about the lives them and their soon-to-be 400 children will live there. We then see Coral come face to face with a barracuda as she swims beyond the drop-off, an attack that leads to her and 399 of their eggs presumably being eaten. And this scene procures the story of an anxious and overprotective father clownfish, Marlin, and his grand adventure across the ocean to save his son, Nemo, after he is kidnapped by two scuba divers. The film presents a story that offers heartwarming emotional appeals pertaining to family values of love, trust, and growing up. So to give a bit of background on the framework that I used for my analysis, narrative criticism was introduced by Fisher in 1984, and it assumes that humans are storytelling creatures that are persuaded more so by stories rather than logic and reason, insofar as a narrative fulfills two criteria. One, is the story coherent? And two, does the story ring true to experiences audiences have had or could have? These two criteria make up what Fisher calls narrative rationality. In 2009, McClure expanded and critiqued Fisher's paradigm by using Burke's theory of identification, which assumes that you, quote, persuade a man insofar as you speak his language, identifying your way with his, unquote. McClure's concept of narrative identification then suggests that a story's consistency with culturally held norms, narratives, values, goals, and notions of rationality, the greater its persuasive potency. So in summary, if a narrative tells a coherent story, tells a story that rings true to audiences' experiences, and tells a story that promotes identification, it is then rhetorically influential. Now to provide a bit of background on grief theory that I used for my analysis, there are prominent misunderstandings of grief and bereavement perpetuated through prominent rhetoric, such as film and literature. And these social norms dictate what grief is and ought to be, but confine many to an experience that does not actually parallel their own. These expectations assume that grief is a linear and temporary process, when more recent grief theory suggests that it is a lifelong process of narrative formation and meaning making. Even though these social norms rarely parallel the actual experiences of individuals who experience significant loss, this dominant narrative is perpetuated through film and literature, and audiences do identify with it insofar as they themselves are not grieving. So this is therefore to the disidentification of those who have experienced significant loss. These social norms are far from ungendered. For example, mothers who are grieving the loss of a child are encouraged, even expected, to grieve that loss through emotional expression. However, emotional expression is often stigmatized for fathers who are grieving the loss of a child. Men are expected to regulate their emotions, grieve in solidarity, and remain stoic when in public, and most importantly, provide for the grieving mother and the remaining children. Research shows themes of emotional regulation among men who do experience significant loss. For example, Cretan et al. In their 2018 study interviewed men who took on one of three roles, either that of a lamplighter, a father figure, or an adventurer. In all of these cases, emotionality is undercut, and the men would grieve by doing rather than by expressing. At this point, I do want to add a disclaimer that action-oriented coping is certainly not inferior to emotional expression. Research shows that grieving by doing and grieving by expressing are both as productive It's not my intention to say that action-oriented coping is wrong. What is wrong is stigmatizing men who do express their grief emotionally. It's not a coincidence that men statistically engage in these modes of grieving more so than women, given the stigma and the expectation that they ought to keep their emotions in check, and Finding Nemo, unfortunately, is a film that perpetuates the stigma. So using these concepts for my analysis, Finding Nemo does tell a story that is coherent, rings true, and promotes audience identification. The characters, even though they are fish, are personified through abstract concepts such as expressing profound emotion, communicating linguistically, participating in human-like activities such as going to school. And this satisfies narrative rationality despite the fact that the characters are not human. And therefore, this identification promotes emotional responses from audiences. Additionally, Finding Nemo is a polysemic text of sorts, meaning that audiences can draw multiple meanings from the narrative. It could be a narrative of disability, a narrative of mental illness. It could simply be a coming-of-age story, or it could be a grief narrative. Finding Nemo is one of many Disney films where a parent either dies or is readily absent. Coral, the mother, dies, as does any spoken memory along with her. And one could argue that her death is not pivotal to the plot, that a father could cross the ocean to save his son regardless of whether or not the mother dies at the beginning. But Coral's death, combined with Marlin's severe anxiety thereafter, shows that this film is a grief narrative. Marlin's fear of the ocean and fear of losing his son tie directly to his loss, and even though Marlin doesn't state his grief, a close reading of his character makes his bereavement readily apparent. Throughout the film, audiences witness Marlin's style of grieving through overprotective parenting, consistently ingraining the message into his son that the ocean is not safe, consistently being at odds with his social reclusiveness and his need to keep his son within his sight at all times. And further, we see that Marlin's anxiety follows his loss. At the beginning of the film, when Coral is still alive, Marlin is not anxious. He is unafraid, he is enthusiastic, and he is excited by the open ocean in his backyard. But following the loss, he relocates with his son, babies his son by helping him with any inconvenience at all, and grants him very little freedom. Additionally, he blames this overprotective parenting on Nemo, thus denying his own grief. Marlin's grief spurred the turn of events that led to Nemo's kidnapping, as well as his adventure across the ocean to save him. Thus, his grief was both his obstruction and his catalyst. When the two are reunited and return home, Marlin has a drastic change in character. He excitedly wakes up Nemo, makes small talk with the other dads in the community, and when Nemo leaves with his classmates, says, quote, "Now go have an adventure." Marlin's grand adventure is over, and presumably, so is his grief. This happy ending is satisfying to most audiences who only know grief through the social norms that are perpetuated through prominent rhetoric. But it upholds these norms that do not parallel the real experiences of bereaved individuals. Marlin gets over his grief, and in doing so, he becomes more likable to his son, more likable to his community, and more likable to audiences, which is not without rhetorical consequence. Given Finding Nemo's strong rationality and means of identification, it is a very persuasive film, as many Disney films are. The film, however, excludes any expression of emotionality or communication about grief at all, and ignores the lifelong experience following significant loss. Similar to the statement that Marlin's grief was both his obstruction and his catalyst, narratives such as his catalyze audience identification by telling a narrative that rings true to social norms, but obstructs any possibility of expanding these social norms beyond the expected one way of experiencing grief. Further, Marlin's style of grieving transitions from coping that is unmasculine, such as expressing emotionality, to coping that is masculine by expressing strength and bravery. Marlin's fear of the ocean and overprotective parenting of his son exemplify emotional symptoms of grieving that leave Marlin with an internal struggle between his grief and his masculinity. At 2 points during the film, we see Marlon try and fail to tell a joke to other dads in the community under the assumption that a clownfish should be funny. And when he fails, he's met with comments like, you know, for a clownfish, he's really not that funny, what a pity. These interactions through my reading are metaphorical of Marlon's internal struggle to conform to social expectations of male grief, to live up to the expectation of a father that is masculine and thus not grieving emotionally. Conveniently enough, following Marlon's grand adventure and re-established, less anxious fatherly role, he is able to successfully tell a joke and follow through on the expectation that a clownfish is funny. Telling this joke represents Marlon following through on the expectation that men must grieve masculinely or not at all, and with this, he is met with praise. He earns his bravery and his autonomy through his grand adventure across the ocean, and it was through this adventure that he faced his fears and thus his own grief. In short, Marlon's response to his loss began as emotional outpourings of anger and anxiety, but became heroic, dynamic, performative, and action-oriented. In other words, Marlon's grief transitioned from unmasculine and stigmatized to masculine and socially accepted. Finding Nemo perpetuates hegemonic ideals of masculine grief by insinuating that grief is not a masculine trait at all, which has detrimental effects against the effort to expand social norms beyond the expectations that grief is unmasculine, linear, and temporary. This analysis is intended to provide a basis for future case studies to expand on Fisher and McClure's frameworks and communicated expectations of how grief ought to be. Analyzing grief narratives such as this can allow one to think critically about grief and bereavement norms as perpetuated through prominent rhetoric. I would like to thank Dr. Sarah Hayden for her advising on this paper, as well as the Communication Studies Department here at the university. And with that, I'll take any questions that you may have.